Hello, and thank you for joining us for this special virtual tour. My name is Ann Cannon, Assistant Curator of American Art at Fenimore Art Museum, and today we'll be looking at some works in our Cooper Room, one of our permanent galleries here at the museum. James Fenimore Cooper was one of America's first great novelists, and Thomas Cole inspired one of the country's first distinctive art movements, the Hudson River School. In the midst of a young country that was discovering itself, their work shaped a view of the rugged and sublime American landscape that remains an influence to this day. During this tour, we will be exploring our museum's expansive collections relating to Cooper and the Hudson River School. To start, we'll be looking at the patriarch of the Cooper family, William Cooper, and we have a portrait here by Gilbert Stuart, painted between 1794 and 1797. William Cooper formed the initial union with the Otsego region. He became a successful land speculator after the American Revolution and eventually acquired tens of thousands of acres in upstate New York. In 1786, he founded the village of Cooperstown at the southern tip of Otsego Lake, moving his wife Elizabeth Fenimore and their children there in 1790. Cooper was also involved in the government, becoming the first judge of Otsego County and later a representative in the United States Congress. Cooper's letters about his experiences in upstate New York were published in a book called A Guide in the Wilderness, which was published in 1810. He embodied the spirit that propelled the building of a young nation in these writings, and even just with his actions. He didn't merely conquer the land, as so many think of when they think of Manifest Destiny and the establishment of America, but he really embraced it, and that was something that he fostered and nurtured within his family and his children as well. So looking back at the portrait we have here, we believe it was probably painted in Philadelphia in 1794, and at the time, Philadelphia was the seat of the United States Congress, which makes sense as to why Cooper would have had a portrait painted there. Gilbert Stuart was the lead portrait painter in the United States from the 1790s until his death in 1828, and he really was known for painting most of the early political leaders of the country. He's most noted for his portraits of George Washington. A reverence for the land developed in the next generation of Coopers, and that was brought on by the way that William really fostered this appreciation for the landscape. William's sixth and best-known son, James Fenimore Cooper, is considered to be America's first novelist. Born in 1789, he never intended to be a writer, spending his childhood exploring the land around the lake and interacting with settlers and the Mohawk in the area. At the age of 13, he enrolled at Yale University but was expelled in his third year after taking part in a very dangerous prank. After he was expelled, he became a sailor on a merchant ship and eventually joined the U.S. Navy, reaching the rank of midshipman. He left the service in 1810. The image we have up on the screen now is a miniature of James Fenimore Cooper, and it's thought to be the earliest known portrait of Cooper. After his marriage to Susan Augusta Delancey, Cooper returned to Cooperstown and settled at Fenimore Farm, which is actually the current site of the Fenimore Art Museum, not the same building though. And at Fenimore Farm, he decided to become a gentleman farmer. Surprisingly, the only reason he really started writing was because his wife dared him to. So I guess we have Susan Augusta Delancey to thank for all of the Cooper novels that we know and love today. His first novel was called Precautions. It was published in 1820 and didn't really do well. He went on later to greater public acclaim with the following works that he had published, and he authored a total of 32 novels, with his most famous being The Leatherstocking Tales. Some of Cooper's writings can be seen as illuminations of his childhood experiences around Otsego Lake and in the surrounding areas. And this is just another portrait that we have currently on display in the gallery. It's a watercolor on paper by Achille de Vieira, who is actually a French artist that Cooper met when he was living in France in the 1820s with his family. Here is our most striking portrait of James Fenimore Cooper by John Wesley Jarvis. This was actually Susan Augusta Delancey Cooper's favorite image of her husband. It was painted in New York City in 1822 and depicts Cooper just before the success of The Spy, which was a Revolutionary War adventure novel that he had published in 1821. And it was the publishing of The Spy that really established him as one of America's leading authors. Cooper's novels inspired many fellow writers and artists, and a lot of the works that we have in this gallery are showcasing those artistic inspirations. So we have here a print by Tompkins, Harris, and Matson after a drawing that is a scene from Cooper's The Pioneers. The Pioneers begin Cooper's famous series known as the Leatherstocking Tales, and reveal his interest in social, racial, and environmental issues. The novel is set in the imaginary village of Templeton, a very thinly veiled version of Cooperstown. The Last of the Mohicans, the next novel in the Leatherstocking series, released in 1826, became an instant phenomenon. Due to the massive popularity of the Leatherstocking Tales, we see, as I mentioned earlier, many depictions of very important scenes within the novels. So here we have a couple works in the gallery by Felix Octavius Carr Darley. Darley was one of the lucky artists who was hired by publishers to illustrate special editions of Cooper's novels. And these are two preparatory sketches done between 1857 and 1859. We have the first, which is Leatherstocking leaning on rifle, and the second, which is a scene from Red Rover. Unlike other books in Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, which are set in New York State, his book, The Prairie, is set in Western territories that Cooper never visited. This mythical idea of the West and of Cooper's imagination features this very expansive space that Easterners could scarcely fathom. This painting, which is a scene from The Prairie, painted by James William Glass Jr. in 1855, was originally titled Friend or Foe, and it depicts Leatherstocking, Cooper's frontiersman hero, at the center, and two companions looking at this thin wisp of smoke rising from the trees in the distance.
The Indian had selected, for this desirable purpose, one of those steep pyramidal hills which bear a strong resemblance to artificial mounds, and which so frequently occur in the valleys of America. The one in question was high and precipitous, its top flattened as usual, but with one of its sides more than ordinarily irregular. It possessed no other apparent advantage for a resting place than in its elevation and form, which might render defense easy, and surprise nearly impossible. An excerpt from The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, chapters 10 and 11, published 1826.
One of my personal favorite paintings in our collection, Landscape Scene from The Last of the Mohicans, was painted by Thomas Cole in 1827. Cole was a friend of James Fenimore Cooper and was particularly influenced by Cooper's writings and his painterly depictions of Lake George as a, quote, holy lake, unquote. When Cole was commissioned by the prominent collector Robert Gilmore Jr. to paint, quote, some known subject from Cooper's novels to enliven the landscape, end quote, he chose this scene from chapter 12 of The Last of the Mohicans. His ambitions for this painting reflected his ambitions for landscape painting in general. Cole manipulated the natural forms of the rocks and trees to increase the tension in the painting, placing a boulder high above the scene in which Cora and the other captives plea for their lives. The rock's precarious balance over an area of sacred ground for the depicted Native Americans becomes a sort of metaphor for the fate that awaits the captives depicted. Painted less than a year after the novel's publication, Cole's work marked the first in a long line of illustrations based upon Cooper's famous novels set in Lake George, some of which we've already looked at. This particular landscape created by Cole doesn't faithfully depict the contours of Lake George, but rather it incorporates various sketches that Cole had made from trips to the White Mountains in New Hampshire. So even though it's not a faithful depiction of Lake George, it is still a faithful depiction of a known landscape. Cole and Cooper became acquainted with one another in New York City, where they were both members of the Bread and Cheese Club, which Cooper had founded. The club had many influential members, ranging from artists and writers to other professionals, including Washington Irving, Fitzgreen Halleck, Henry Inman, Samuel F.B. Morse, and William Cullen Bryant. These two portraits are our homage to the Bread and Cheese Club. One depicts fellow club member Fitzgreen Halleck, done by club member Henry Inman, and the other was painted by Samuel F.B. Morse, depicting Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who lived from 1517 to 1547. He was the founder of English Renaissance poetry, credited with introducing the sonnet to England. Morse, who was the inventor of Morse code and the telegraph, originally set out to be an artist and painted numerous portraits of notable figures. He and Cooper were very close friends who actually traveled to Europe together, and Morse often visited the author in his homes in New York City and Cooperstown, most notably in 1829, when he painted several portraits of prominent residents, which can be found in the Fenimore's collection.
The Catskills heave from the valley of the Hudson like the subsiding billows of the ocean after a storm. I cannot but express my sorrow that the beauty of such landscapes are quickly passing away. The ravages of the axe are daily increasing. The most noble scenes are made desolate, and oftentimes with a wantonness and barbarism scarcely credible in a civilized nation. The wayside is becoming shadeless, and another generation will behold spots now rife with beauty, desecrated by what is called improvement, which, as yet, generally destroys nature's beauty without substituting that of art. Nature has spread for us a rich and delightful banquet. Shall we turn from it? We are still in Eden. The wall that shuts us out of the garden is our own ignorance and folly. Thomas Cole, Essay on American Scenery, 1836.
The Hudson River School was America's first true artistic fraternity. Its name was coined to identify a group of New York City-based landscape painters that emerged about 1850 under the influence of Thomas Cole, and flourished until about the time of the centennial. Cole, featured in the museum's collection along with Asher B. Durand and Thomas Doughty, were all prominent members of the school, and they influenced a generation of landscape painters. As the name suggests, the first wave of the movement focused heavily on depictions of the Hudson River Valley region and the surrounding areas of New York, including the Adirondacks, Catskills, and White Mountains. This is Thomas Cole's View on the Schoharie, painted in 1826, one of the examples of Hudson River School paintings within our collection, and another example of Cole's work. This landscape shows a relaxed man overlooking this vast panorama of wooded hills. We see the lightning-ravaged tree, which serves as a reminder of mortality, and we can also note how the light on the settled valley and the village of Esperance, New York, in the background there, contrasts with this dark intensity of the passing storm. A largely self-taught artist, Cole purposely composed his landscapes to portray images that delivered strong messages to his patrons and public, which we can also see him doing in his landscape scene from The Last of the Mohicans. Another member of the Hudson River School, Asher B. Durand, was also very good friends with Thomas Cole and James Fenimore Cooper. This is his Hudson River looking towards the Catskills, painted in 1847. Compared to other works by Durand, this painting is unusually large in scale, and we can see that it depicts people enjoying the beauty and tranquility of the Hudson River near Rhinecliff, New York. The graceful forms of the trees seem to offer shelter and lead the eye of the viewer to the picturesque Catskill Mountains in the distance. And we can see the ideas here of the sublime being used both in the Hudson River looking towards the Catskills and in Thomas Cole's View on the Schoharie. The Hudson River School's depictions highlight the distinctive wildness of the region. They utilized elements of the sublime. The sublime is this feeling of terror mixed with awe that one could experience standing on the precipice of a cliff or feeling dwarfed within a monumental landscape. It's that type of feeling of almost unsettled, but you're drawn to it. These aspects were what the Hudson River School painters aimed to capture in their scenes of the wild, unruly landscape that made up the Hudson River region.
I would not speak of the Great Lakes, but of those smaller lakes, such as Lake George, Champlain, Winnipesaukee, Otsego, Seneca, and 100 others, that stud like gems the bosom of this country. Thomas Cole, Essay on American Scenery, 1836.
If we look to Cooperstown and the surrounding areas, Otsego Lake has been referred to by Cooper as a, quote, glimmering glass, end quote, or glimmer glass, which instills the idea of tranquility, which Thomas Cole echoes in his essays on the American scenery. Cooper and Cole have had very similar ideas when it came to depicting landscape in their writings and in paintings, respectively. Each had the same artistic imagination and upheld the idea that a landscape could express deeper meanings. Be it a timeless or descriptive quality, they tell a story within their scenes. To conclude our tour, I wanted to look at one final member of the Cooper family and one who is also incredibly prolific, and that is Susan Fenimore Cooper. She was in the third generation of the Cooper family, James Fenimore Cooper's seventh child, born in 1813. Susan was her father's assistant and editor, and a prolific writer in her own right. Her most well-known publication is Rural Hours, published in 1850, and is considered to be a forerunner for works such as Thoreau's Walden, in its portraiture of the seasons, nature, and life in pastoral New York State. Susan Fenimore Cooper's devotion to her beloved community continued with the establishment of several charitable organizations, including the Thanksgiving Hospital in 1866 and the Orphan House of the Holy Savior in 1873. Otsego Lake and its surrounding landscapes continue to be animated by the same spirit that enamored the Cooper family. While William Cooper's fortitude introduced the splendor of the region to American settlers, the prose of his descendants captures the harmony within the landscape enjoyed by both visitors and residents today. And the scenes that artists such as Thomas Cole depicted also help enliven that imagination and bring visitors to the region. That concludes our tour. I hope you enjoyed learning about Thomas Cole and James Fenimore Cooper, and I encourage you to stay tuned for a live Q&A.